tankers being struck in the Mediterranean, many, many miles away from any sort of Ukrainian forces. There are also reports of a Russian ship carrying nuclear reactors for North Korea that has sunk in the Mediterranean, believed to have been hit by a torpedo or some sort of underwater drone. Nobody is suggesting, or not directly suggesting, this is Ukraine Special Forces, but the reach is phenomenal. And the intelligence to be able to do this, again, is phenomenal. So I think when you look at the way that two sides are operating at the moment, on the one side, the Russians are operating in a very simple fashion, just using soldiers really as cannon fodder and making very little progress, but huge amounts of casualties. Whereas the Ukrainian forces are really at the tip of the spear, the tip of the technology, doing these incredible long-range attacks.
Hamish, the Bretton-Gordon is a retired British Army colonel, former commander of NATO's and UK's chemical, biological, radiological and nuclear reaction troops. Welcome to our program, Colonel Hamish.
Thank you very much for having me.
The US has offered Ukraine 15-year security guarantee as a result of the latest meeting between Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy and US President Donald Trump in Mar-a-Lago. Also, Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk said that UK and US could deploy ground troops to Ukraine as part of this security guarantee. What is your assessment of the results of meeting between President Trump, Volodymyr Zelenskyy, and this security guarantees deal to be signed in January next year?
Well, this is very complex, and it's difficult to get a completely clear picture. Donald Trump says the deal is 95% complete and done. But the one people who have not commented, or who have commented negatively, of course, has been the Russians. When we look at the security guarantees, President Zelenskyy was after a 50-year guarantee. Trump's turned that down to 15 years, which, on the face of it, sounds pretty good. You then talk about putting US and British boots on the ground. The Russians have always said that this is a red line for them, having NATO troops on the ground. And the initial reaction to the Trump and Zelenskyy meeting at the weekend has been very negative from the Russians. So it's, it seems on the American side and the Ukrainians and the NATO side, there is an agreement for this peace deal. But of course, the one person who has not given an opinion, and the one person who is responsible for the war in Ukraine, President Putin, hasn't commented at all. And in fact, as has been widely reported, the Russians are claiming that Ukraine has been attacking one of Putin's palaces where he lives, and they're saying that completely changes their metrics. Now, that information that Russians have put out about Putin's palace being attacked is without foundation. In fact, it seems to be classic Russian propaganda and lies. So on the one side, it would appear that the coalition of the willing and President Trump think that they've got a deal. But of course, the belligerent in this, and the person who's been so difficult all the time, is Putin. And some of those close to him, like Foreign Secretary Lavrov, are really putting a very dim picture on this. So it's a little bit difficult to know without the full engagement of the Russians. But the plan being put forward, basically, President Zelenskyy and the Ukrainians have really bent over backwards to really answer all the questions Trump said. The possibility of turning the Donbass into a demilitarized economic zone, the possibility of withdrawing some troops from some areas. This is everything that Trump has demanded. But of course, the Russians are yet to comment, and that what is coming indirectly from the Russians is not very positive at the moment.
Also, US President Donald Trump said that this peace negotiations were in the final stages. Also, he's really confident that he can make Vladimir Putin accept this peace offer. Meanwhile, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy said that both Russian and Ukrainian troops should withdraw equally in case of such deal reached on the Donbass. What is your take on that and on the possibility of creating demilitarized zone? And would Russians respect such a deal? Don't you think that this could become another Trojan horse? Because Russians just can exploit this demilitarized zone to advance and move forward with another offensive?
Well, I think, first of all, whether President Trump can persuade Putin to accept this peace deal is one thing. President Trump hasn't managed to do that over almost a year of his presidency, despite saying that he'd end the war within 24 hours of coming into the White House. So what President Trump says and what he does are not always exactly the same. The idea of having a demilitarized zone, again, from a military perspective, I'm not entirely sure how this would work. Is Trump thinking about putting US troops in between the Russian forces and the Ukrainian forces? Who knows? And of course, also, the Russians have said that security guarantees like this would be, in effect, Ukraine during NATO, by default, which is a big red line for the Russians as well. I think the concern that you've highlighted there is a major one, that actually this demilitarized zone, if the Russians do agree to pull back, will probably give them the opportunity to regroup. And it was only reported on the BBC earlier this week that the Russians have lost more soldiers in the last 9 months. The rate of loss has been higher than any time throughout the war. And we know that the Russian military is struggling. We know they're struggling to get more manpower. So, a pause in the fighting for a year or so would, I think most people who look at this closely, the Russians would take advantage of that to reconstruct their forces and rebuild. Having said all that, I think everybody in the world is desperate for peace, except for Putin and the Russians. And if Trump can persuade Putin for peace, then that would be a major step forward. But unfortunately, it all seems to be on Russian terms at the moment. And what has been offered, this 95% plan, might seem reasonable to you and I, but the Russians, no doubt, will try and squeeze more and more out of it. And ultimately, of course, Putin's aim, as he's always stated, is to subjugate the whole of Ukraine, and that is far from achieving that. So whether Trump has some really powerful levers that he can pull to force Trump to force Putin to agree, that is not entirely clear. But until the Russians engage in this latest peace deal, it's going to be very difficult to see, what the validity behind it is and the likelihood of success.
Let's also cover situation on the ground and successful Ukrainian operations in the city of Kupiansk. As of today and as of this week, it seems like Ukrainians have managed to push back most of Russian troops out of the city of Kupiansk. Also, President Zelenskyy made this surprise visit to the city. What is your assessment of military situation in Kupiansk, and how did Ukrainians manage to successfully push back Russians out of the city?
I think the situation in Kupiansk is similar to other places, particularly sort of areas of Petrovsk down in the Donbass as well, where in the last few weeks, in particular, last couple of months, actually, Ukraine forces, very much supported by Ukraine special forces, have recovered a lot of ground that the Russians have taken, in the preceding few months. And I think this is a positive. One thing, it shows that the Russian military is really struggling, and the losses that have been encountered, a lot because the Russian conscripts who are going to the front at the moment are very poorly trained, very poorly led, whereas the Ukrainian forces have managed to concentrate their forces. They've managed to train and use some good tactics and principles of war to be able to overcome the Russian conscripts. So I think it is a very positive thing, and particularly in key towns like Kupiansk, this makes a very considerable difference. And hopefully Trump is fully aware of all this, that actually, it is Ukraine forces that have the upper hand at the moment. And it is not the Russians who are about to pile through and take the Donbass, far from it. In fact, it's the other way around. So at the moment, I think Ukraine is on the front foot, as we'd say, is in a position of strength. And that should be recognized in any peace deals moving forward. And let's hope that continues. And also Ukraine's deep battle, attacking Shadow Fleet tankers in the Black Sea, striking targets deep into Russia, particularly on the oil infrastructure and elsewhere, are really having a considerable impact on the Russian economy. And Russian people are getting more and more aware of what is happening in the state of their economy, and are beginning to question in a much deeper degree the actual war itself. So it would, maybe a month or so ago or 2 months ago, one would have assessed that the Russian forces had the upper hand. I think that is different now, and Ukraine is making great progress. And hopefully that might be a factor to get the Russians to agree to the peace deal that President Trump thinks is almost done.
Let's also cover the most brave and daring Ukrainian special operations and these deep strikes, just to sum up the main results of this work by Ukrainian armed forces. So Ukrainian underwater drones have struck Russian Kilo-class submarine in the naval base of Novorossiysk. This submarine was used to launch missiles on Ukraine. Also, for the first time, Ukrainian drones operated by Ukrainian special services have struck Russia's oil tanker in the Mediterranean, so more than 1,000 miles from Ukraine. Moreover, another Russian general was killed in Moscow. What is your highlight of this year of another year of Ukrainian resistance and special operations against Putin's war machine?
I think the Ukraine special operations, if you highlighted there, have been dramatic and really excellent. And I'm sure the rest of military forces around the world are trying to learn about it. The destruction of the Russian nuclear submarine was an extraordinary operation, and although a low-level attack, it's a strategic impact. This is apparently a submarine costing $300 to $400 million, a key submarine for launching Russian cruise missiles, apparently in a safe Russian harbor. It has been destroyed by underwater drones. In a similar fashion, a tanker has been struck in the Mediterranean, many miles away from any sort of Ukrainian forces. There are also reports of a Russian ship carrying nuclear reactors for North Korea that has sunk in the Mediterranean, believed to have been hit by a torpedo or some sort of underwater drone. Nobody is suggesting, or not directly suggesting, this is Ukraine Special Forces, but the reach is phenomenal, and the intelligence to be able to do this, again, is phenomenal. So I think when you look at the way that two sides are operating at the moment, on the one side, the Russians are operating in a very simple fashion, just using soldiers really as cannon fodder, and making very little progress, but huge amounts of casualties. Whereas the Ukrainian forces are really at the tip of the spear, the tip of the technology, doing these incredible long-range attacks. We saw Operation Spider's Web many months ago now, where Ukraine Special Forces and drones attacked strategic Russian bombers deep into Russia. But that really set the tone for these type of operations. And a number of very senior Russian generals have been taken out as well. Again, not directly attributed to Ukraine Special Forces, but that is the sort of inference. So I think it is all having a big impact. And I expect, that is why Russian leadership like Sergei Lavrov and others close to Putin, are really trying to shape the narrative so that people believe that Russia is in the ascendancy. But no, I think all of us military commentators in the West and part of NATO are incredibly impressed by what Ukraine forces have been able to do. And a small country like Ukraine holding and pushing a massive military like Russia back really is a fantastic credit to the Ukrainian military and the Ukrainian people.
Let's also cover the state of the Russian army and Putin's illegal war against Ukraine. According to CNN, by mid-January, Putin's war against Ukraine will have dragged on longer than the war on the Eastern Front that began with the German invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941 and ended with the fall of Berlin in May 1945. What is your assessment of this grim milestone Russia is approaching right now?
Well, it is a very grim milestone, and the fact that it's all in a fairly similar piece of geography, piece of ground. We talk a lot about Kursk in the Russian border, where of course some of the great tank battles of the Second World War were fought. The Russians against the Germans, and horrific amount of casualties. But we're over 80 years later, we're seeing casualty rates similar for the Russians. And it's just, it's remarkable that they can continue at this scale, but their sort of tactics appear not to have evolved very much since the Second World War. And, and the reason that they've got taking so many casualties, I think, is probably exactly that. And it can't be going unnoticed in Russia that this is happening. And very soon, Russia is going to exhaust its supply of criminals to get out of jails, supply of ethnic Russians from deep in the east of Russia for the army, and the young men, predominantly men, of the white elite in Moscow and St. Petersburg are increasingly going to be going to the front line. And I think when that happens, the sort of oligarchs and the wealthy minority in Russia are going to start really questioning this war. But the fact that we're almost reaching the 4-year mark of a special military operation that was supposed to last a few days really shows how poor the Russian leadership judgment is, and how they really do not know what they're doing. And it is desperate that President Trump, who is still the most powerful man in the world, cannot bring Putin to the negotiation table to get a just peace deal for Ukraine.
We just covered Ukrainian operations, but let's cover also the state of Russian state, Putin's regime, because Russian oil prices have fallen to their lowest levels since 2022 to just $40 a barrel, according to Bloomberg. I assume there is no enough coverage of this Russia's weaknesses in the Western media. In what state does Russia enter the year of 2026 in terms of economy, military power, and negotiations? Don't you think that Vladimir Putin is walking on a thin ice right now?
Yeah, Putin must be very, very thin ice. Everybody thought a few years ago that if the price of oil fell below $50 a barrel, the Russian war machine wouldn't be able to continue to exist. Putin is almost totally reliant on sales of oil in order to keep his war machine going. And of course, in the past, he's been able to undercut the world price and still fill his coffers with many billions of dollars worth of money. Now that some people like the Indians and others have been encouraged by President Trump not to buy Russian oil, the fact that the world price is falling below $40 a barrel, the Russian coffers will be empty. Now, of course, Russia has reserves of gold that it will be using up, but not even Putin can make ammunition and build tanks with no money. And a lot of people, and Bloomberg and others, assessing that the Russian economy is in absolute dire straits. Unfortunately, for the rest of us in the West, where things like this have a great impact, and governments that are democratically elected can be democratically got rid of if they destroy the economy. That's not the same in Russia. The Russian people for a long time now has suffered huge inflation, above 20%, huge interest rates. Even the price of basic foods is exceptionally high. And the Russian people are really suffering. However, in an autocratic dictatorship like Russia, the sort of common people have very little say on these sort of things. So I think most importantly, and I suppose for Ukraine and the West, with the money running out in Russia, eventually his war machine is going to grind to a halt. Now, let us hope that Putin realizes this and comes to the negotiation table for the deal that is on offer at the moment, because we know that he can't grind on for a lot longer as his money runs out and he runs out of manpower and ammunition to keep the fight going. Because, of course, what the Russians need to understand is, if you get to that sort of scale of the Russian military and economy, you could very much easily see actually Ukraine turning the tide much more significantly than it is doing in places like Kupiansk at the moment. And it wouldn't be beyond the bounds of possibility of Ukraine actually taking back vast strides of land in the south and the east that the Russians have taken in the last couple of years. So let us hope that Putin and Lavrov and the others who advise him realize that the situation could turn very much against Russia, and actually a peace deal now is probably the best they can hope for.
Let's also cover our final topic. What is your prediction of the year of 2026? How close will we be to achieving peace in Ukraine? Because President Trump says that the war either ends in the upcoming weeks or goes on indefinitely. What is your take on that?
Well, I suppose there's predictions and there's hope, really. I think we all hope that the war ends very quickly, as President Trump has suggested. But President Trump has been suggesting for a long time the war will end very quickly. And if President Trump loses interest, which he is wont to do quite often, then yes, it could grind on. However, I do see, if it does grind on, I think one side is going to get much stronger and one side much weaker. And the Russians, as we've already discussed, are running out of money, manpower, and everything else they need to wage war. Conversely, Ukraine, that has held on so valiantly for 4 years, is getting stronger and stronger. And I think as important to Ukraine is that European NATO countries are now investing significantly in their military, rebuilding their forces. The Germans spending 200 billion euros on their military, increasing their military to over 250,000 soldiers, and similar to Poland and other countries, all investing in military capability and air power, which is providing a much stronger, more solid defense around Ukraine. And of course, as I have called and others have called, European NATO countries should support Ukraine much more directly. I'd like to see NATO countries providing some sort of air cover, no-fly zone over civilian targets in Ukraine. That would be something that NATO could easily do to prevent Russia attacking hospitals and schools and power stations, stuff like that, which I think that NATO could do as well. So the hope is that this peace deal will have some validity and will get the Russians around the table so that the guns can stop firing. But if it doesn't, then unfortunately things will grind on. But as long as we in the West keep supporting Ukraine, I think eventually Ukraine will start to dominate the battlefield in Ukraine and push the Russians back. But ultimately, I think everybody wants a just peace for Ukraine as quickly as possible. And if Trump can deliver that in the next few weeks, then that would be great. But it's not a certainty by any means.
Thank you, Colonel Hamish, for your time and for your support for Ukraine, and glory to Ukraine.
Thank you very much for having me, and glory and victory to Ukraine in 2026.